Heimo and Edna Korth made the difficult decision to live in the merciless mountains of Alaska, where the majority of people would perish. Through more than 4 decades of some of Earth's worst situations, they have depended on their abilities, instincts, and one another. But they haven't only had to be strong, they've had to overcome heartbreak along the way. A tale of unfathomable loss lies behind the picturesque landscape and self-sufficient way of life. Why aren't they ready to leave the land that has both provided for them and taken from them? How did they come so close to being broken? In order to fully grasp what we are about to discover, let's start from the very beginning. Unique among their kind, these residents of Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge practice true off-the-grid survival. Due to its extreme isolation, very few people call it home. The Korths are among the last indigenous peoples to continue subsisting solely on their land. This life was not Heimo Korth's birthplace, though. Although it wasn't enormous, his hometown of Appleton, Wisconsin was larger than Juneau and Fairbanks combined. His parents, Eric and Irene, were not fans of spending time outdoors. He never learned the skills of fishing, hunting, or trapping, even though his dad was raised on a farm. Instead, he found a stable and predictable job working in a factory. Working in a Wisconsin factory was another attempt at that lifestyle, but he quickly realized it wasn't for him. As a child, he felt an irresistible pull toward nature, regardless of how close he lived to the city. When the other kids ran toward town, he stayed put. Just a short distance away, there were trees and open fields waiting to be explored. He often traveled alone, not out of necessity, but because he was the only one who appeared to enjoy it to the same extent. By the time he was a teenager, he couldn't resist spending time in the woods. He embarked on his journey to pursue his dream in 1973 at the tender age of 18, departing for Canada's Northwest Territories. People were suspicious of an 18-year-old traveling north during the Vietnam War. Not many were on his side because they assumed he was evading the draft, but he was adamant about establishing his own life in nature. In his first job, he assisted a shooting guide, but the meager wages were barely enough to cover his rent and food costs. The woods continued to beckon him, even after he returned to Wisconsin, but he had no other option. Eventually, he had the opportunity to assist a guide in the Brooks Range of Alaska who hunted large game. At the age of 20, he decided he had had enough of civilization and disappeared into the woods. He met a friend who ran an Alaskan trapping line after working as a shooting guide for a while. This friend did more than just offer advice. He also whisked him away to a remote house and supplied him with everything he needed. For the entire 3 months, Heimo and the wild were the sole inhabitants. Trapping was a skill he struggled to master on his own. Tragically, he lost nearly all of his possessions when he fell through the river's ice, exacerbating the already dire situation of nearly going hungry. Putting pen to paper, he had no option but to contact his former employer and request assistance. The $500 check from his boss caught him off guard. Just getting back to town and getting back on track was enough. A change, though, had occurred. The woods now held him. For him, this was the ideal life. For the remainder of that first winter, he resided on St. Lawrence Island, a tiny Eskimo settlement in the Bering Sea, barely 90 miles from Siberia. They didn't immediately begin dating after meeting there. A native Yupik, Edna came into this world on January 25th, 1954. Done is her given name. Living off the land, hunting and fishing were the skills you needed to grow up in the area. Uncle Jack Muck was an expert fox hunter. He instructed her on how to skin the furs safely and how to handle them afterwards. It was at that point that Heimo became like family. He was very close to Edna's dad, Emerson, and spent a lot of time with him. Moreover, Jackson took him under his wing and instructed him in the ways of the hunt and fur trade. As soon as Jackson made the joke about Edna being Heimo's wife, he knew that Heimo liked her. However, Heimo had no intention of speaking. He wished he could avoid being the subject of gossip in a small town where everyone knows everything about everyone else. He aided CS in running the neighborhood store and picked up hunting skills from the top hunters in town. He visited Fairbanks's Beaver Creek in the spring, a river in the White Mountains. After abandoning civilization, Heimo returned to the wild. For the summer, a friend of mine needed someone to watch their dogs at their house out there. It was extremely difficult for Heimo to survive the subsequent 2 winters deep in the Brooks Range. Hungry country is a nickname that Alaska has earned. Well, that's pretty much it. Setting traps was a challenge, food was scarce, and the weather was perpetually chilly with deep snow and freezing temperatures. Conflict arose daily. He became a true mountain man during those winters, even though he didn't make much. Without a doubt, he proved that he could endure and thrive in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. After much searching, Heimo finally located the spot along the Colleen River. Lost in the wilderness of Alaska lay this river. The Porcupine River had a smaller tributary. Unfortunately, most of the prime fur trapping locations in and around the Yukon Flats had already been claimed by the time he arrived, making it impossible for him to secure enough fur to sustain himself. Conversely, Heimo was invited to join his friend Bob, who had been hunting in that area earlier, further up the river. He traveled upstream for nearly 50 miles, without realizing it at the time, but this spot would end up being his permanent residence. Returning to Song-A Iksa after a 3-year absence, he was overjoyed to reunite with Edna. He had forgotten how lonely he had been without her until he laid eyes on her. As a fur fishing for Dolly Varden, by the late 1970 saw she had made her way to Heimo's mountain home. Upon seeing his creation for the first time, she immediately urged him to improve it. Not even she knew if it was the best course of action to tell him to start constructing a proper house for her. But what she said was what she meant. Then he began working. Prior to winter's arrival, he had to complete the task. That's the reason he put in an entire week of non-stop effort. The first snowflake fell at the exact moment that the final component was installed. Edna and Heimo tied the knot in 1982. They were cut off from the world for the better part of a year due to a lack of electricity, water, and communication infrastructure. In the fall, they would go hunting and fishing to ensure they had enough food to survive the long, cold winters. All right, Edna had experienced the pain of love's rejection before. Heimo changed her mind about her impending marriage to a Swedish scientist. Melinda and Merlin were the names of their 2 children. Tragically, he died in an airplane crash, and she was left to raise their children alone. Being a single mother was incredibly challenging for her, and losing her husband was an even more devastating blow. Even after dating another guy, she still wasn't happy. The next man she dated was unsuitable, as her uncle witnessed firsthand, due to his infidelity and lack of reliability. That is why her uncle exercised caution in the presence of Heimo. He wanted Edna to know that this man was unique and would take good care of her. In due course, Heimo demonstrated his abilities. Even though Melinda only lived with them for a portion of the year, he adopted her as his own. The time she spent in Savona with Edna's parents was the most comfortable for her. Throughout Edna's upbringing, her son Merlin resided with her parents in Savona. Grannies and other relatives raised many children, but Edna still had a tough time of it. Even while it was painful to be apart from them. She longed for the safety her children would receive from her parents, but she knew deep down that she couldn't find it in the wild. Only 4 months after Edna and Heimu's wedding, they welcomed their first child into the world. She was given the name Colleen in honor of the Colleen River. Charming and engaged like a blossom in full bloom was Colleen. She rode on Heimu's back, picked strawberries, and played in the river with Edna during the summer. But it was her favorite pastime. Because she enjoyed getting lost, Edna sewed a small bell onto her coat so she could keep tabs on her. That little bell would jingle with every step the family took on their nightly walks along the river. Similarly, the moon piqued her interest. Whenever it appeared in the sky, Heimo would raise her up so she could see it more clearly. She would then point and yell, "Moo moo!" After that, the unthinkable occurred. Colleen was only 2 days old when she tragically passed away in a river accident. Nobody ever found her corpse. Being sad was a horrible thing. Even though they were told to leave the bush and start over somewhere else by the Korth's family and friends, they were unable to do so. Colleen lived in this house. Her laughter resounded even in the wind. The ground bore faint imprints of her footsteps. The loss of her memory would be the equivalent of leaving. Heimo fashioned a wooden cross for her upon their return to camp that day. He painstakingly inscribed her name and the dates of her brief life onto it. In the autumn, he and Edna lugged the cross up a modest hill that overlooked the river and valley. The fact that they placed it there betrayed their love and grief. They sought to have the mountain commemorated in memory of their daughter. Despite their repeated requests, the Board of Geographic Names remained silent. There was a lack of recognition for Colleen's historical significance.